This is Vibrant Spaces, a show about placemaking, activating, and connecting city spaces for the communities you serve. Welcome to the wrap-up episode of this season of Vibrant Spaces podcast. Whoop, whoop. Book ending. I love it.
Every story has to have a beginning, middle, and end. So this is perfect. I'm excited for today.
Exactly. But we can run in series. So this is just series or season one, friends.
Season one.
Like a well-oiled TV show.
Speaking of which, we should probably introduce the cast. So without further ado, this is the amazing Emily Craven. For those who have not caught on yet, she is an excellent placemaker and vibrancy expert, I will say. She's been working actually in this space for about a decade. But one of the things that I really love about Em is that she didn't start in the vibrancy space. She actually she went to school and became an astrophysicist. So she really wanted to lead that Trekkie universe into existence. Though what she really discovered is that she didn't really care too much about slingshotting ships around planets, and what she really cared about was the stories that happened while the ship was slingshotting around the planet. So those dramas and those pieces that came in. So she became an amazing
100%.
author. She's a published author and a renowned editor, as well as she has been doing production in the vibrancy space for cities now for about a decade. I love all of those pieces about you. I think the thing I love most about you, though, is that you're a very well-versed traveler. I know that you've called...
Love it.
Yeah,
Love
called 2 countries home, I believe, Australia and Canada, and had visited another 32. You were telling me about the age parity that you were able to keep going for a while.
Was country age parity for a bit there, for just a glorious moment.
I think it's definitely a goal of mine. I love to travel, and so I think that's something I really respect about you. But I think the cool part is how many cities you've gotten to experience while you've traveled, and the way that you've gotten to see X city do this festival, Y city do this kind of art installation, the way that you've seen community collaboration work, whether that's in Asia or Latin America, or even in the Vatican, where you got married, the way that they do events.
Way to out me, Tim.
Not everybody can say that.
She gets married in the fanciest place in the world.
She did, but you got to see how a city like the Vatican runs events, and I think that's really, really cool. And so it gives you a very unique perspective that not everyone can say they've done it or have experienced. So I think
it's true. My documents will live forever in those archives.
They will. You will be remembered no matter what. You've achieved the legacy. Check the box. You can retire now.
That's right. And here, over to my right, is the delightful Tim Souza. So Tim here is our head of community activation at Story City. He has, I think, the most insane title of a degree that I've ever come across, which is Peace, Justice, Entrepreneurship, and Technology, which I feel like more... Yeah. Well, I also feel like more degrees should have that combination, because I think that it's equipped you to do some really interesting things. So you in your career have tackled really hard things with a combination of technology and collaboration, right? So you worked on anti-human trafficking projects where you brought together tech, startup, government, police forces to work on anti-human trafficking and capturing people in, legally admissible manners. And that's it's such a hard thing. And most people would look at human trafficking and be like, nah, too big, can't handle it. But I think that it really speaks to how you look at that wider problem, and you look at, well, what are the smaller things that contribute to that we can control? And then how do we bring partners to the table to do that? Right. And so I think that is a really interesting degree, and it gives you this ability to handle those sorts of things in a really interesting way. And surprisingly, even in something like real estate, which you worked in for multiple years as well, where you get to see how people can universally apply things, but then also localize them, right? Because real estate is the same everywhere. You're buying and selling houses, but there's definitely a very local element to it. And if you move cities and become a real estate agent in a different city, it's a completely different ball game to previous ones that you've been in. And so there are things you can apply across all of them,
Right.
but
Yeah.
you have to also have that local knowledge. So like, how do you take and adapt, but then leverage nationality to cover when people come in from interstate, in from international, to live in a new place? I think, what's the statistic on that? Like every 5 to 10 years people move. So
Yeah. Americans are every 7 to 10 now. Yeah. It used to be 5 to 8. Now it's 7 to 10.
yeah, and that's also a very helpful skill set, particularly within placemaking,
Hmm.
right? How do you universally take things that have worked in other areas that are based on human psychology and behavior and how we react to space and advertisements and conversations and negotiation, and then what can that turn into on a local level?
Well, yeah, no, absolutely. I think that one of the things that I absolutely love, and obviously I'm a nerd about it and I have a degree in it, it's exciting. Solutions come out of the environments that we live in, right? And I think of like Uber as an example. I love when people come to visit California because they're like, "Oh, we'll just hop on the bus or I'll hop on the train." And I'll be like, "No, like you're not just going to do that." Uber was designed because we don't have good public transit within our cities. It's somewhere where California like falls apart. People think of us as this technological leader, but it's not efficient. And so we talk about, where do those solutions come from? Well, Uber was designed out of a need in the Bay Area for people to not park their cars on the streets. Not everybody owns a car, but they still want to get to that party in time. So what did they do? Pirate taxis. It was a solution that existed in Latin America. They pulled it over into North America. They put an app and a brand on it. They created that community trust, and the solution thrived in the environment that it was designed for, right? In the San Francisco area, moved to LA, boomed there, then it began to spread like crazy. And we've all got to witness how that innovation has shifted and changed other communities over the last, how long has Uber been around? Like a decade?
A little bit more, but yeah, right
Yeah,
about there.
yeah, right about there. But we've watched that transition and change. But that was a solution that was crafted very specifically to handle a Bay Area problem. And I think that we've seen that pattern repeat itself a lot in tech, where stuff was crafted for Bay Area problems and then rolled out to other communities because they found, parity in the need for the solutions that were being crafted. But all that to be said, yes, I get really excited about this stuff. Thank you for that beautiful
And
introduction.
and I think that that's what I find really interesting about delving really deeply into issues of vibrancy with cities, right? Because there are a lot of very locally grown solutions, but for some reason in this city ecosystem, they then don't move outside that city, right? And then that causes problems and
Mm.
continued vibrancy, and it feels like you're rolling a ball uphill. And I just don't think that that's necessary. And I think that a lot of the projects that we have seen in this season have shown that it doesn't need to be that way.
No, and I think that what you're tapping on, and we'll jump into it, I think, in a little bit, is the idea that there's not a scaling desire for a city to come up with a solution and then scale its solution to other cities the way that you might have a tech company do. And
Because it's
so,
public money, and that's not the mindset of public money.
well, and it's not what people pay their taxes for. They don't pay their
Mm.
taxes for me here in San Luis Obispo, I don't pay my taxes so that people over in Bakersfield can benefit from my contribution. And so because of that financial system, I think we'll talk more about that as well. The way the finances are set up really do create the container for cities to play in. And I think our hope with this podcast is that we can begin to drill holes in those containers so at least people can see some solutions. And maybe we
No,
can do
no,
one of those.
don't give a leaky bucket analogy. I don't know whether that's
Not a leaky bucket. I was thinking more like those old telephone with a can and a string, and you talk to your neighbor on it.
Yeah,
Like all we're trying to
okay,
do
okay, yep,
is
okay.
create like holes, string size holes, so your tin can talk to the thing next to you. I think that's part of our goal, is that we're breaking
Yeah,
down those barriers a little bit and allowing
yeah.
cities to share those ideas.
Yeah. And I think so the whole reason why we wanted to have a wrap up episode is that we got to hear so many amazing ideas, and I really want to pull all of those threads together, right? We
Mhm.
often sit in our little city vacuums and we only listen to that one Baltimore episode, or we are that one Kansas City episode. And so I want us to start weaving threads between all of these cities. And in this wrap up, being like, what are the parallels we can draw? What are the connections that we can make? What are the ways that we can expand and build on the things that we are doing so we are not so siloed? And to give those who maybe have only listened to 1 or 2 of the episodes in this season, it's only a short season. It's only 7 episodes. Like, I recommend you go back and look at it. But like in this season, we visited the city of Tampa with Robin and Stephen. So they were really focusing in on listening to constituents, building feeder lines between neighborhoods and cities to really build a cohesive network. Then you had your city of Kansas City. So we got to visit Kansas City twice in this season. We met Will and Elliot, who really were a backbone of a lot of community and events that happen in Kansas City. And then Melissa and Jared, who are those like event gap fillers, I suppose you'd call them. The cultural shift changes. I think they're not going
That's
in
probably
there
a
to
better-
fill in. They're not going in there with the idea of filling in event gaps, but like a lot of what they do does help in that case.
Yeah. And then we ended up in the city of Baltimore, and we got to talk to Tanya Miller Hall, who is a phenomenal human being, but she's really kind of talked to us about collaboration between city and community. And so her role has been bridging and giving access to the mayor's office to, quite honestly, community that hasn't had that access before. And so we talk about what she did with graffiti and street artists and providing them that access, what she's done with taking communities that have been neglected and providing them direct access. And so really looking at the value of how do you build up community by giving them access to that positional power. And then the next week, we got to see what that systemized collaboration looked like. Also talking with Cassie, Shalonda, and Faith, all of whom are involved in the downtown transformation known as Downtown Rise, bringing together all of the different efforts that the city is having, not just this is what the city department is doing and that's what transportation is doing, but this is what these organizations in the city are doing, nonprofit, for-profit. These are what our assets are. How can we bring them all together, collaborate as a singular system, an entity that has multiple parts? Very much.
And give them additional pots to pull funding from to make shit better.
Right. And then we finally finished off our season in Philadelphia, looking at how Raheem Manning is building a city for overlooked people, but specifically the overlooked people at night, that nighttime economy. As a nighttime manager, his role is to really oversee how are people getting access to their banking and their groceries and their medicine when they get off their shift at 4 a.m. How are we designing a city to be inclusive of all people? And not just using the typical delineations that we do around demographics, but also including that demographic of our nighttime workers, which in the city of Philadelphia is about a third of the population. So how are we ultimately designing for the constituents? Kind of leading back to our conversation with Tampa. Begins
and using kind of that augmentation, 100%, you know. I think that there was also a thread of healing through a lot of these communities as well. Like in Baltimore, it was something that I kind of got a history lesson from you, Tim. Like I wasn't, as an Australian, as a Canadian, we obviously have our own kind of historic racial divides, but like I hadn't known what redlining was. Like I didn't know how that kind of worked. And so to kind of see the healing that all of these departments are on in trying to bridge those historic gaps and bridge those historic vibes and make sure people feel heard, whether it's in Tampa with the Soul Walk, whether it's in Baltimore with the intense like collaboration they're doing with like Squeegee Collective and Downtown Rise, or whether it's in Philadelphia where they're trying to be able to celebrate history, but at the same time acknowledge the past.
Yeah, I think that what our cities are currently in a stage of doing is reconciliation. If I'm going to put my peace hat back on, and not reconciliation as in like, we're going to get a peace and reconciliation committee, we're going to sit down and do these pieces, but in the same methodology, what you see in the city of Tampa is that the city of Tampa has re-gifted the highways that they came in and just dropped in the interstate system over Black communities. They are coming in and a couple of those highways are flagged for removal. There's work that is physical infrastructure work being done to create that reconciliation with the Black community in Tampa to right those historical wrongs. And I think that mode of reconciliation that you see within people is a desire to truly build better moving forward, right? It's not about, hey, we're going to change this thing or do this thing because it was wrong in the past period, which is, I think, speaks to the heart of the change makers in these cities, as they want to reconcile these wrongs. But they're doing it because they want to build the cities stronger, healthier, better moving forward. And to do so, they are leveraging art and culture to help with the healing of these cities, so that when they talk about what the next era is, when we look at a couple of our cities that are focused on FIFA coming up in 2026, they want to present a healed city, not a city
Mhm.
that is still struggling with its own past, which I think is part of the beauty of what we kind of uncovered as like a, not a main theme. It wasn't what we were looking for, but it was fascinating to
Oh,
see that despite what we see in the news, despite what we see out in mainstream media, cities are actively working on making sure their communities are healing and moving forward together. I think that's beautiful.
and I think that
Mhm.
that's a value in looking at what other cities are doing to
Mm,
find that inspiration for your own life, because that's how innovation happens. Like the Uber example that you just gave, like it happens when people bring new ideas
mhm,
into a space and you kind of get this Venn diagram of local culture with need, right? And
right.
like an Uber had to adapt to completely different markets. Things are different in Asia in comparison to the US, in comparison from California to the East Coast. And that Venn diagram does shift and change. But I think in my mind, this podcast is about taking our background in tech tools and methodologies and applying them to cities. And taking that, the idea of things like UX, like user experience, and that understanding that we see in places like Kansas City, right? It's taking those kind of interconnected ideals and not seeing things as silos and not necessarily replicating things because of funding structures or budgets or whatever that might be, like learning to work within those limits of what you have, but to do it in an effective way that looks at a bigger picture rather than a downtown, a square mile of blocks.
Right. Yeah, and I think, to use a popular phrase that we've seen trending on TikTok, coming from one of the presidential candidates in the US, you think you just fell out of a coconut tree. You really do exist within the context of all that you live and all that came before you. And I think that this conversation is truly looking at, like, how are you looking at everything that exists within the tech space, within the culture space, within the social justice space? How are you leveraging all of these assets? Because true innovation does happen in that Venn of the Venn diagram. That's where you get disruptive change. That's where you get new pillars that strengthen a community, come out of people saying, hey, let's take this idea and mesh them together. And I think that hopefully what we have been able to do in this podcast is truly begin to show you some of these ideas next to each other, and hope and allow for our audience, for you guys, to look at this charcuterie board and build your own little plate of all of the things that you think could be useful for your city, in the context that your cities exist in a tech context, in a social context, in the context that you are not alone as a city facing these challenges, but other cities are also facing these challenges. And you can kind of do what they did in Philadelphia and see what cities in Europe are doing and say, hey, we want to steal that and adjust it for our people, our community, and our taxpayers. So I think
And,
that
and I
that's
think another through line for all of these cities as well is that all of these cities have would appear to be really great mayors, right?
mm,
So like they
I agree with
who acknowledge or are upfront with problems
you.
in as much as a politician can
Be
acknowledge and be upfront about problems. They don't necessarily try to control but empower people. So they have people put in place to address things based on those various skill sets. And that has resulted in these varied paths of vibrancy building and placemaking as well. So I
mm,
think that that's an acknowledgement as well, is that sometimes your city is not in the right moment. And that's why leaders are so important, and why I was so excited that we spoke to these leaders in their city, because it really is such a core factor. But at the same time, I think that when you look at the bios of the people that we spoke to, they stepped up to become leaders. And I think that all of us can step up to become these types of leaders as well.
mhm. And I think this actually leads into a great question that I hope will guide the rest of our conversation, Emily. So if you were to design a city from scratch, okay, so we're talking about leaders, we're talking about social movements, we're talking about placemaking. How would you activate a city via placemaking if you were to look at everything from the community plans, community building, fundraising strategies, the departments that have impact, community-driven change, all of the things that we've spoken about this season, plus maybe a little bit of your own knowledge thrown in there, how would you design a city for people in this audience being like, okay, these are a lot of great ideas, guys. What would it look like to pull them together? I want to hear what the city of Emily would look like.
Right, because you can't enact all of the things that we talked about unless you had a really, really, really hardcore superpowered wand. So if I had a
Right.
moderately hardcore superpowered wand that I could wave around and make my own like Wizard of Oz City of Emily, Emerald City. Okay, all right. I would this will probably say a lot about our personalities. So I would be focusing on building a city that is not insular while celebrating who we are in that city. So it's not just about researching all the things that other cities have done, but like taking execution level things that you can apply across multiple cities and being a part of that network. And so I think that the key things that I would do would be to install a creative director, UX lead for the city. It would be to put vibrancy and vibrancy related roles or departments under economic development, not tourism.
Okay. So I can see you're pulling a little bit from Kansas City. You're pulling a little bit from what we've seen in cities like Austin,
Philadelphia. Yeah,
Philadelphia.
Austin. Yeah. I would build feeder lines in that kind of like systematized way. I would be building things that link neighborhoods to downtown. I would be trying to build the feeder network.
Giving
I would
Tampa.
probably use storytelling as like a main vehicle for that. I have butted my head against enough red tape in municipality land that I would probably take a Melissa and Jared approach of top down approach to change is probably where I would
Fair enough.
be. Yeah.
Okay, let's dive into this. Has been a discussion that we kind of like
before we dive into this, because you know that I can go on rants. I want to know like what's your base city look like first before we dive into
so my base city would definitely, well, I'll just be contrarian and say it would be bottom up driven community. I think that leadership is important. You'll laugh at me, it's true. I'm just gonna go bottom if you're gonna go top, that's just, maybe that speaks to my life a little bit too personally. But what I would do is definitely I love the bottom up approach that we saw out of Baltimore, and with all of my peace background and training, really that community collaboration screams justice and healing to me in a way that I absolutely love. So in the Emerald City of Tim, we would want to make sure that everybody feels like they have participated in the experience of building that city, though I do recognize that leadership is important. And so I would make sure that there was a council of mayors. I know those exist, but I'd make sure that I have shoulder tapped and have kind of like on my board of directors as leader in the city, or for whoever the leader of the city is, that they can.
When you say council of mayors, you mean like mayors as in like multiple cities mayors, or you mean like the night mayor,
that's a great point. I think what I was thinking was like, who are the 5 mayors that I would want on my speed dial to quickly get a hold of and say, hey, I'm facing this problem. What solutions are you seeing in your city? So I would make sure that the mayor of Tampa and the mayor of Kansas City and the mayor of Philadelphia are all on that list, because they have obviously taken steps to empower people to help. And so to have a grassroots community, having leadership that understands empowerment of others is something I would find really important. But at the same time, like you said, feeder lines, I would go and do what Kansas City has done with Mayor Quentin Lucas and make those free. So I think I would begin to ask the true question of what is the role of government? And the role of government is to serve people. And if we are going to drive economic change, I want people spending their money in the places that those feeder lines can take them, and less on that transit. So if I have to rejig that tax, that's how I would do it. But at the end of the day, we need to bring fun and hope back into cities, and people need to be able to freely understand that they can go out for a drink at night and come back home and get there and back safely. So I guess in that way, making a night mayor, maybe there's a day mayor panel and a night mayor panel, but the idea of allowing people to move freely and safely at all times. One of my favorite things about the city of Singapore is I had female friends who would look at me and be like, Tim, I feel perfectly safe walking down the street at 2 a.m. with my purse in one hand and my phone in the other. And I feel like I could do that every night. That vibe is what I would love to bring into whatever cities. I want people to feel safe. I want people to feel connected to each other. And to me, culture and art should be the driver for that healing, like we've seen in some of these cities. And that needs to be housed underneath economic development with opportunities for that fund to grow and to scale and growing. So commercial partnerships via whether that be billboards or hotel tax, et cetera, creating an environment that people want to come to, want to visit, and making revenue off of those to continue to fund that solution, I think is just as important and valuable. So that would be the base of my city, is that again, you just talks about our styles, but the objective and the goal is to have a fun, safe, communally driven city. To do that, you would want to make sure that you have the right voices as mentorship and leadership is concerned, and then making sure you have the economic structure to support that and to continue to drive that change as you move forward. So that would be high level mine, but do you have thoughts and feedback? I'm open to.
I feel like I would like to visit your city. Your city, the Emerald City of Tim, would be a great and fun city to visit. I think that, yeah, I think that it does really encompass that fun. You want cities to be fun and hopeful, right? Right. I think that's what truly a lot of collaboration does, is bring hope into things. Like, what would your collaboration spectrum be? Because we've seen a lot of like spectrum, like level of collaboration in these episodes, like you being the collaborative person, that bottom up mentality. Like,
I think I would do something I've wanted to do for a long time. I would probably design a system leveraging technology. Everybody has this in their pocket. So how come the city is not here, right? How come the city is not in your pocket where all of your friends are, where all of your
but Tim, it's
food
on social
is?
media.
Huh? That's true. I would probably design a way for that collaboration to be accessible in the city. So I'm thinking like a Reddit system where community members could post their thoughts, their feelings, their pieces of what is happening on a consistent basis, like on the day-to-day when you're thinking about it and you go to your mailbox. I want you to be able to post on the city subreddit for mailbox problems, right? Maybe it's located in the wrong spot or whatever. Post it there, and then have like teams and committees that would meet to go over those pieces that are community driven, and then having like town halls set up so that the top issues can be discussed, but everybody knowing that those issues are coming from the community directly collaborating. Like you have to have an address in the city to have access to this.
Yeah, so very kind of Baltimore-esque in that, like, you are bringing everyone together once a week type of a deal where you know everyone doesn't believe the same thing, but you are leaning in to bridge the differences.
Leaning in to bridge the differences, but then the piece that I would differentiate that from Baltimore is then I would take that data that we'd be collecting, that consistent stream of data. I would build an innovation team that's whole job is to address those issues. And we take low-hanging fruit, kind of like they did out of Kansas City, honestly. Low-hanging fruit, what can be changed? Like when Melissa came in and changed the trash, that's the solution. Yes, it cost money, but the solution was simple. Get the raccoons out of the trash. That's a very bottom level thing, but it created a substantial change for the city, which brought people on board. And so that's the kind of movement that I would do, is I would take those low-hanging fruit that everybody interacts with. I quickly address those challenges, I guess, in a way that like Baltimore made their list of here's our things to do in the next
what are the things that we can achieve in the next 18 months that are implementable, that take the assets that we have, that takes this, what was it, $10-30 million pot of money that the state gave us, and
addresses them,
distributes it and addresses them.
Yeah. So I guess that's how my collaboration, you ask on the spectrum, it would be like intensely collaborative and community oriented, that would funnel down into like action, like teams that are taking action on things, and then having a little bit of a strategy from the leadership that is based on what our learnings. But I guess, yes, I've been sold by Baltimore. Baltimore has sold me on their straight up. I would, and then
leveraging your mayor feedback.
Those direct lines of communication. I will say that the tantalizing prospect of a Melissa-tocracy is something that if I was king, I would love. Right?
It's work.
It works. It works. Yeah. And so I think that there's a part of that does need to be brought in. And so you do need to instruct your leadership to function accordingly. So I do see where your method of like a Melissa-tocracy / a top-down approach.
Yeah. And so we, in our little cities, we handled like the idea of feeder lines in different ways. To me, like I'm building feeder lines with storytelling and activation and
Mm,
events and history and like very like soul walk related kind of feeder lines for me. But when you talked feeder lines, you went directly to like free fares on streetcars.
I did, yeah. I think that the free fares on streetcars, again, I went there because it's about moving people and providing people opportunities within the city. Like the city's job is to be the container that holds life of the residents. And maybe this also comes from when I was going through school. The city of Kitchener holds the second largest Oktoberfest globally. And during Oktoberfest, you do have to pay for buses most of the year, but during Oktoberfest, busing is free because they don't want drunk people on the roads. Right. And so it allows for you to get downtown. So during Oktoberfest was great. I was on public transit all the time. Outside of Oktoberfest, I was less on public transit. I'm talking about like on my way to work and on my way to school, not just on my way to a Haas to have beer.
And I think the thing about adding free fares, I suppose, into that mix is that you then get a ridership, like a level of ridership that means that you get more consistent streetcars and more consistent timing, and you can put more staff on, and all of a sudden like your expenses for running that system are very fixed because because you know what the volume is that's going to be coming in, and because it's so, and that's what makes Singapore work really well actually, is the reliability of its train system and its transit. And so I think that is definitely what free fares do in that regard.
But I think it's the cost. So if everyone's riding that transit system, what's the cost to the police department and the fire department and public responders for all of the accidents that you can pull off the road because of it? What is the wear and tear on those highways and on those roads and those overpasses that you don't have to worry about because you're taking that many vehicles off of it consistently? So I think to measure the full effects of the value of a free fare rider system really has to be.
But it would also like it have effects on health, because like you would go to a stop and then you walk from your stop to where you're going, and then that walking past shops then has you engage with those shops, and then it provides economic development because you're walking somewhere rather than just driving directly up to the door and getting angry that you couldn't park outside the door. And it improves that, and it allows for, because Edmonton has this issue where we don't have a great public transport system and we have a lot of traffic, but then we have like really large roads that are unpleasant to cross, that are like are really difficult in that manner as a pedestrian. So you don't really want to be on the ground in those areas, which affects businesses and all of that sort of thing. So, okay, I can see infrastructure.
Yeah, but tell me why feeder lines, when you're thinking like story, these pieces, like what's the value for you there over, or maybe it's in conjunction with a free rider system, because we know.
Because I think that, so to me, storytelling is a vehicle for your efforts to be seen, right?
Ooh, okay,
and so like when Soul Walk, it started out as African American history. And specifically, one of the main things that they started with was African American history in African American cemeteries and forgotten cemeteries, right? Like it started very, very niche, right? Very niche topic, pulling from history books or projects that had been done and then had been sitting on a shelf and being like, how do we bring them to life so that they are visible? So to make them visible, you have to, yes, build infrastructure in the form of public art or whatever that might be, but you also have to tell a story. You have to tell a story in a compelling way that makes people care about it, and in a way that makes them notice it when they are in a particular area. And so that small storytelling from a small set of cemeteries, which, like, let's face it, cemeteries are not things that people visit regularly, right? Except around Halloween, right? And so from there, it's now blossomed into this thing where you now have the Latino community coming and being like, we want to be a part of Soul Walk, and we want to contribute to Soul Walk, and we want to be a part of this feeder line of neighborhoods to city and of cultural understanding of downtown. And then that acts as an education piece to the influx of technology and technology companies that they've had come in from California. We are storytelling creatures. Like, we will tell each other stories. Like, the reason why I tell you case studies all the time on this podcast is because we are wired for stories, and the people that we are drawn to are the people who tell those stories. And so if we make sure that we integrate storytelling as a feeder line. So that, great, you've built the infrastructure, but why am I going to go and visit that park if you haven't given me a reason to?
Right.
Okay, it's pretty. I've visited it once, done. But why am I going to keep going back? Because you tell me stories about it, because you set things up that allow me to then have experiences that I then tell as stories to others, which then make them come back, right? And so
Right.
how do you, yes, you need the physical infrastructure, events are great, but then how do you keep that storytelling alive so that people can find it at opportune moments
That's
where that
interesting.
builds things in? And so you see that in the design pieces that Kansas City were
Mhm.
putting together. You see that even in Art After Dark.
Right.
People who attended that event, that was storytelling. A whole bunch of artwork now exists that continues to tell a story. Now, a lot of people are going to walk past there and wonder, what was that for? And then if you continue to tell that story, then Ton, you might start seeing businesses move into that space that was empty
Right.
storefronts, and right. And so that
So you're
story is really important. Even in Baltimore, they were telling us how important it is to start talking positively about their city, because they've had a lot of negative press from,
Mhm.
The
Well, and
Wire and all
and
that
their
sort of
city has
stuff.
lost like 400,000 people in population, right?
Yeah.
Like due to economic change, COVID, what we're seeing downtown's face, but also because of that press, because people are buying into that story, so they're not moving to Baltimore.
Yeah, and they're also buying into the story in that a lot of people won't visit downtowns because they say that they feel unsafe. And yes,
Mhm.
sometimes that's part of the houselessness problem. And there are various practical things that have to go into that. But if you're putting in that effort in the same way that Baltimore is putting in that effort with the Squeegee Collective and all of those sorts of things,
Mhm.
you need to let people know that you have put in that effort, and then you need to help them, ease them into having positive memories in the space.
Well, so like really what you've
Not just
angled
tell the
this.
story, they have to have positive memories there. So them learning that you did blank, 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 blank is a bit boring. But if you gave them something to do in that space.
Right. Well, because what you are really talking about is leading. The reason you're the feeder lines, the reason you're leading with arts and culture, kind of what my argument was in the beginning, and I see your value in saying we're going to start from there, and we're going to connect these spaces that have story, and we're going to tell stories that connect stories, and really allow people the opportunity to have their own experience, right? Because it's not like you were saying, it's not about what so and so historical figure did in this park. It's about what you're doing in the park. That's what makes that personal connection. And what you do in the park is going to look different than what I do in the park. But you need to provide, basically build containers for people to have those experiences in those spaces, and then bring their friends back to have a similar but unique experience, right?
Mm.
In
I
that
would, I
same
mean,
park.
yeah, and city UX is so important to the point that I would probably, like, can you give multiple creative directors? I think the idea of like a director is that this one kind of person, but like you would have almost a team where you have the Jared type person who is making sure that that design
Mm-hmm.
across departments is happening, right? So everything looks very similar, that it is joyful, that it incorporates an element of arts and all of those sorts of things. But then I would probably also have another person whose job it is to look at what is the storytelling layer of that. And I don't mean in traditional media and arts communications where we're putting out press releases that we've done a new project, and no, like how do we literally lay stories into all of those designs? Is it within plaques? Is it within something like Story City? Is it within a podcast about the city? Like, how is that story being told, and what methodologies can people access that story? I would almost like dual layer of like design, infrastructure, and storytelling, which then brings that
That's
feed a line on like a whole bunch of human levels.
So I would propose that the Emerald City of Emily and the Emerald City of Tim need to become one city. And on that proposal, I think that I would add on your, as a part of your directors, taking the role that is a traditional director of like finance kind of role,
Mm.
and really reframing that to how the city can generate money to fund what you're talking about. Right? So if we're having a singular experience for users coming into the city, if they are experiencing paying taxes to a singular entity, right? They should be receiving that singular entity back as far as communication is concerned with your UX and with your storytelling. But also, I think that how we fund these pieces is what a lot of people get hung up on. A lot of cities get hung up on. It's like, great, I want to do these art things, I want to do these storytelling things, but like the financial structure is just as important. And so we
Yeah,
have,
which I think is why both of us put vibrancy under economic development,
I think so,
right?
well, because
Because
the cities that we've talked to who've done a good job at the vibrancy and the placemaking and the storytelling are the arts and cultural groups who are directly tied to that.
correct. Yeah, because they're
Yeah.
not necessarily scrounging for grant funding. It's acknowledged that this arts and cultural and vibrancy are very tightly linked and that it can't be an afterthought in a line item of a city. And I would very much stress that I would put that vibrancy under economic development, not City Hall. I understand that
Ooh.
Tonya was
Mhm.
under City Hall, and her role is really helping connect artists directly into City Hall and showing the importance of that. But mayors are under the most scrutiny on what they spend money on. And for that money, an economic development level money to come out of a mayor's office is just not going to happen,
Right,
right?
which is why I think that you need a director of like finance who understands that vision and can literally prepare things for leadership for the public that tell that story, because numbers tell a story too, which is why people always go back to them, right? You can say, hey, we spent money on this public installment, and then like, great, that was $100,000, right, of tax money. What's the value? You can directly see the value of those pieces. But if you're able to say, hey, we spent $2 million this year in creating vibrancy that drove this X number of people into our, let's say we're focusing on downtown, so downtown space, right? We were able to get the growth numbers. Like if that same director of finance could also work with, because they're economic development focused, worked with those
data or
bids,
analyst of some kind. Yep.
look at what the bids are doing and say, hey, look, we actually increased revenue for our small businesses downtown X amount because of all of these things that we have done, these pieces that we have placed together. And I think that the reason I even suggest that is I know I hear from you all the time how the granting system just gets your goat. Like you just get so fed up. As
So
someone who's lived in
hard
this space for a
because
while. And can you
yes,
give us a
because
lens for
granting
those who don't experience it too? Just a little bit. Just a little bit of like, here it is. This is why I hate it. Go. I'm giving you a
okay.
thoughtful map.
So granting systems build a reliance on the granting system, particularly for arts and culture, because in the granting systems and the way they are, they don't give you the full amount of what you need, and they expect that you will bring X amount of dollars into this relationship. And a lot of the time in arts and culture, that is you not paying yourself to bring your X amount of money to do something that is of vital importance to vibrancy to the public, right? And so what happens is that you don't pay yourself, therefore you do not have money to reinvest in the next thing and ask the city for less money or ask the granting body for less money, because you are reliant on that money because they have made you reliant on that money because you can't get ahead. Right.
Gotcha.
And so like that's what gets my goat about granting systems, is that there's a lot of burden on someone to put that application together, which they don't get paid for. And then they are expected to not pay themselves basically to get that grant. Right. And so it causes a reliance. And then what happens is that very experienced people can't get themselves out of the system because they can't build enough capital to do so. And therefore, that then doesn't let emerging people enter into that cycle to be able to upskill, develop, build a career, and then be able to exit out of the system as well. So you don't get any new voices because experience is a de-risking thing in the eyes of the government. So the same people just get the money, and you don't get any new people who come in and get the money. And so to me, the way that I would like fix a granting system is in a little bit more of a tech startup kind of method. So in Canada, they have a grant, I suppose you could call it system, a loan system called the Canada Media Fund, where the idea is that essentially they invest X amount of dollars in you building a digital media property, whether it's games or a film or whatever that might be within that creative arts and media space. And so they essentially give you a grant, which up to a certain point, you don't have to pay back, right? If it turns out to be a bad idea or you didn't get enough of those numbers or whatever that might be, yes, it acts as a grant, and you can test a bunch of ideas to see what will and won't work and that sort of thing. But beyond that, if you want to get the big dollars from this kind of granting system, the idea is that it is bringing you to commercialization. And once you commercialize, for 7 years post that commercialization, you pay 15% royalties of like ticket sales and things like that back into the pot. So the idea is that, say you got $1 million from this funding agency, and through all of the ticket sales and things that you do as part of your event or as part of the game that you sell, you pay back 15% royalties until you've paid back that amount, right? If you don't end up paying back that amount, if it wasn't as successful as you hoped it was, like the leftover bit ends up being a grant, but you haven't just given away $200,000 that's never going to enter your coffers again. Like, you got back $100,000 of that. So that's less money you as a city have to put back into that granting program. But if you pay back the amount that they gave you as part of that grant before the 7 years is up, you continue to pay a 15% royalty up to that 7 years. So if your project is wildly successful, the funding body gets overage money, which they can then take and then reinvest in the next emerging person to come out of that. 15% is small. You have clearly made enough money as an organization to be able to run yourself. And the idea is that you graduate out of that program, that you don't need to go back to the CMF to be able to pull that money, because you now have an established studio that has street credit, that is able to build on ticket sales and money and all of that kind of thing. And so that's what I want to see more of in granting systems, right? That allows for that cycling through, but also that payback in the way that, like, a lender, it's like a 0% loan, but you are paying back into that loan, and then you pay overages if you're really successful in it. And so it rewards people for being successful. And then that success then gets to be enjoyed by the community by funding additional things.
Interesting. And so it's basically, its name makes more sense, the Canadian Media Fund, because it is a fund that people contribute to and hopefully continues to grow, and that is down to the management of it. So then, to counter that, how do you feel about the system that Will introduced us to in Kansas City? I know that it's not a granting system, but it works somewhat similarly, of community-driven
I would argue
events.
that's a granting system.
It's just
Like,
a nonprofit funded granting system. Like, it's just a different.
Yeah, correct. So rather than being from the government, it's just from a non-profit, but it's still the same thing. They'll only give you half, 75%, whatever that is. And there is no, because as part of like the CMF application, it's around like, how will you commercialize this? Have you thought about your audience? Have you thought about how you'll bring that audience in, right?
So the distinction being
And so,
truly
like,
building
yes, they ask
entrepreneurial.
numbers about tourism and that sort of thing, but like, for that project to me to feel truly effective is that you would want it to, yes, have a tourism impact, but you would also want it to have a local impact as well. And you would want it to be set up in such a way that people can graduate out of the program and self-sustain.
That makes sense. And so it's really kind of like
you
like the incubator model.
We're only granting to nonprofits. They are not, like, the way we view nonprofits is that they're not allowed to spend a bunch of money on marketing, and they're not allowed to hire the best people, because that's seen as wasting the funds, right? And so that's probably one of the main issues that I have with that program, is that they only give to nonprofit, and those nonprofits don't pay back into the fund. And we know that with proper marketing and those sorts of things, you're going to bring more people in, but people don't like it when you spend dollars on marketing. So I think that the nonprofit system is broken in that manner, and how we view nonprofits and how people must spend the money within a nonprofit, that I think that it is not as impactful as it could be.
Not as impactful as like the Canadian Media Fund solution. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Interesting. Which is still government run, right?
It's still government run. I'm not saying don't make it government run or don't make it nonprofit run, but like, if you're restricting things to a nonprofit circle, it's going to limit the sorts of impact that they can make as a result.
So then, if we were setting this up for the MTIM City, Emerald City, how would you set that up tax-wise, et cetera, for the people so that it makes sense? Would that be like a levy that you would put on small businesses, like through a BI, like a business improvement district? Would that be would you fund that through a billboard system?
Yeah, probably. I would probably fund that. I'd probably fund that through a billboard system, or like the CRAs that they have in like Florida, but also probably a developer, like how they take some of the developers is 1% for arts. You know, the developers make a ton of money. You could probably do a 1% for art, 1% for like the fund, and then like a 1% for programming. I feel like that could be expanded. Like Melissa talked about like an open spaces tax, right? Like so you'd have an open spaces tax, so like a 1% for art tax, and then a fund. I think the developers can take a bit more.
You're like, okay, so anyone that lives out, it'll be a little bit these days building the city.
Yeah, particularly considering all of the incentive programs and things that happen for those. But that'll probably be where I would pull that from. I understand the beds and heads tax in Kansas City then funnels into that fund to then fund other tourism related things. But I think that we really need to stop thinking of tourism as being 40 kilometers external of the city. Correct. You've got to think of tourism within your own. If your economy is thriving internally, in the same way that I think like New York City has a very thriving internal economy, then it is going to draw an external economy that helps feed
grow it. So what you're really proposing that is tying that fund up probably in the same way that Austin's UNESCO City ties it up.
Hopefully, I'm trying to get them to speak on the next season, guys. Don't want to preempt. Don't want to preempt here.
Well, we look forward to it.
Hopefully,
exactly. So going back to what your proposed city was, it was a lot about breaking down silos within the city structure and creating this singular entity. But I get the feeling that you're leaning towards something outside of cities as well.
I think so. Maybe this is where my collaboration kicks in.
Okay.
Right. Or maybe this is where like ultra like Melissa fiduciary responsibility like mindset kicks in.
Okay. Got you.
Right?
So your responsibility to your taxpayers is what?
Is to be able to keep costs down while providing a high quality of life. And if you're Melissa and Jared, fun, right? I see a lot of like, yes, you have a creative director in Kansas City who's like trying to streamline all of the design and whatnot. But another key thing that they were really doing was making sure that you didn't have two departments doing the same thing, right? That they didn't do the same thing and that they weren't just spending their money on doing
the same thing.
The same thing and marketing the same stuff with slightly different angle, right? And I think that not only do we get siloed within cities, but we within like city departments, but we also get siloed within a city itself, right? And sorry to throw your app idea under the bus, but like apps are a really great example of this. So like a lot of cities will build standalone apps, right?
Okay.
So they acknowledge that they're in the technology age, but the people in the city are not technology people. They do not come from a tech background. They do not come from a startup background. They do not come from that startup culture. And so as a result, we've ended up with this plethora of apps that's causing like really hardcore app fatigue. Right? Where you go to a new city and they're like, download our tourism app. And you're like, I don't want to download another app. But not only is like download the blank city tourism app, but it's download the blank museum tourism app. Right. So it's even more granular. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so as a result, what happens is that because they're standalone apps, they all need their own marketing. Right. And so each department then gets
servers, they need their own
servers, they have to maintain the technology. And building technology is expensive. I know because it has taken me many years to build Story City, and we have spent a lot of money building Story City, right? And so people will drop that. They have to, they'll be like, oh yeah, a $50,000 budget will be enough to build an app for us to do tours around our thing. And then they look and they speak to developers, and developers are like, $50,000 is not enough to build this app. And people are like, ooh. And so they scale back, or they just do, QR code reliant things or whatever that might be. And so like you get all of these standalone apps that cause app fatigue that make each of those different departments have to spend money. Right. And so the thing that tech and startup culture is really great at doing is like looking at that general need and then having an overarching thing. And so that's where social media exists and works really well, because each city can market directly to its citizens and constituents within social media and within paid advertising within social media, but it does connect them across the world. And it's one platform that everybody is on, right?
Part of that is that the tech company is paying for the design of that platform. They're paying for the servers. They're paying for the insurance for the use of it. And those cities only have to pay for access to like I want to put 10K in
the
marketing.
content or access to specific audience, right?
Correct.
Exactly. And so when people are like, yes, let's bring technology into things, they don't then ask who has to maintain that, what division has to maintain that. Mayors cycle out sometimes every 4 years, or election cycles, and so those departments change, and then the budget allocations change, and then who then gets saddled with an aging asset that they can't bring up to standards because technology is expanding so quickly, who's
Well, like
making
a
it
great
relevant for a
example
new generation, and all of those kind of things, right?
Right.
Like,
I was just jumping in to be
yeah,
like, if AI is not incorporated, anything that you built 2 years ago that does not have an AI interface is now not as valuable to people because they're expecting generative conversations and that to be incorporated. And so in the next 2 years, that's going to become standard and commonplace, right?
yeah.
So if your
And I
tool
mean, like,
can't develop from 2 years ago to 2 years from now, and you can't make that technological jump, you're
exactly.
contributing to that app fatigue because people don't want an app on their phone that's not going to do what they want.
And so this is maybe like a cautionary tale around technology in cities, and why you'll speak to someone, they'll be like, oh yeah, we tried self-guided walking tours and it didn't work. And you're like, yes, well, if your marketing department was garbage and you were using a white labeled app, that's probably
Why?
why. And so when we think of like city and building city vibrancy, and considering the fact that like a lot of vibrancy is about convincing people to move in and take up residences, convincing businesses to come in and open factories and all of those kind of things, if you only have a siloed festival that happens here, a tourism app there, or whatever, like within your city, how are the people outside that city going to be able to hear or access those things? And so when we talk about vibrancy and making sure that our cities are not siloed, you want to be looking at what are the things that allow me to connect to other cities, obviously showcasing my culture and all of those things, but what allows me to connect to other cities where, as a fiduciary responsibility, I am not wasting my money on developers, or I am not wasting my money on reinventing a particular type of pocket park or whatever that is. How can you access a network from other cities that allows you to be fiduciary responsible, and then allows for that network to happen, like that network effect that you see in tech companies like an Uber or like to happen, but for you as a vibrancy in a city. And so that's what I would encourage people to think about, in that, yes, do all of the research to all of the different cities, but rather than necessarily just taking that thing and adapting it to your city and just running it in your city, be like, how could I connect things so that Jane's Walk is a multi-city movement, right? So what are the movements that I can step into and tap into? What is the technology platforms that will span multiple cities rather than just one? What if I'm investing in a light installation from companies that do inflatables for festivals? Are there ways that I am leveraging the different cities that they have been in previously so that people in those cities know about my city? Right? Like, how are you leveraging and building and stacking those things so that you're not creating a museum app and a city app and a blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. As you were sharing that story, I have the Little Mermaid, Ariel, with a fork twisting in her hair, singing, I want to be where the people are. I'm sorry, that's just what was going through my head. It's the concept of like, you need to be, speaks to my brain slightly, but you need to be in the spaces where people are. And you need to.
Like, yeah, like so several of the cities we spoke to were FIFA cities, right? So rather than you being like, I'm just going to spend my $5 million budget in Philadelphia in the same places that Kansas City is spending their $5 million budget, with your powers combined, you can combine city marketing budgets to be even more
Wonder
impactful.
cities. Boop.
Yeah, Wonder Cities.
Hit my
Exactly.
boop. There it is. Do the little Wonder cities. Boop.
Sorry, for those of you who are listening in podcast form, maybe you'd need to watch the YouTube version of this
to see the boop. But like, but yeah, I think you're right. And I think it's looking at it, and especially FIFA is a great example. You have multiple cities with people going to those cities. So there's a certain amount of what people are going to expect. I'm going to FIFA city should do X. Great. That, that's going to be on their radar, but they're going to be jumping between those cities. So you're going to have people going from Philadelphia back to Atlanta, back to Kansas City, back to Atlanta, back to Philadelphia for maybe the semifinals. So as they pop around, right, people are going to want there'll be some consistency, but they'll also want those novel things. That's why they're going to Atlanta. They're going to Atlanta to do something they couldn't do in Kansas City, etc.
Actually, so this point brings me a little bit to wrapping up our wrap-up episode, because one of our next season's guests, the city of Tulsa, is really great at acknowledging the fact that their people going out into the world and connecting to other cities is a great way for them to spread the word about Tulsa and get people to move there and visit there. And I don't want to give the episode away. I'm not going to give the episode away, but Tulsa,
we're excited for
Oklahoma, in the next season has a really interesting way that they do that. Right? How do they do that actually with their musicians? Because Tulsa is a very musically based city. It is starting to get a Nashville style reputation for music. The Tulsa House at South by Southwest was pumping. And so we got to speak to that wonderful crew there. And so they have a really interesting way of using musicians to do this, right? To build that network, to use that human capital, to be able to build that asset layer in the same way that Story City tries to do that with technology and storytelling. And someone in Atlanta is going to do X thing, and then they'll go to Kansas City and do Y thing. And the marketing budgets of all of those help get more people involved in city life and vibrancy. So there's a bunch of exciting things that are coming up in season 2. Tim, did you want to maybe drop a couple of gems of what
here's a couple
can look
more
forward to?
Here's a couple more gems. We're going to be back in Baltimore. Baltimore's doing some crazy, cool stuff. So we're going to be back talking to Midtown, seeing what they're up to. We're going to be back in Philadelphia as well, talking to some of our lovely Raheem Manning's colleagues as he talks about what he's doing at night. We're going to hear about what's going on in Philadelphia during the day. We are leveraging some connections and working towards a couple more cities. I'm just going to throw Jersey City and Austin out into that mix. It'll be a fun season to truly take a look at how people are engaging their cities, but then starting to do what we've landed in at the end of this discussion, which is send out those feeder lines into surrounding cities, not just within themselves. With that, I think I'm excited to see what happens next with this podcast, and what happens next as we bring stories and fun and hope back into people's lives.
Me too. And a big thank you to our guests who were in season 1. You guys are innovative. You guys are whip smart. Your cities are lucky to have you. Thank you for your generosity in going into the nitty-gritty of everything from funding to budgets. We love the transparency and the honesty and the positivity. This has been such a fun season of celebrating the good that we are doing in cities. We understand the world's full of a lot of
not good at the moment,
shit and politics and all of those sorts of things, but you guys are doing good work and innovative work, and we are so lucky to have had you on the podcast and to have you as references to be able to talk to so many people about vibrancy and bringing downtowns to life. You've changed our lives and our perspectives in so many positive ways.
Absolutely. And I think I would love to close with a quote from one of my favorite movies of all time, Remember the Titans. Attitude reflects leadership. And we want to just also thank all of the mayors for connecting us to these people this season. The amazing people we got to speak to are a reflection of their leaders, and a reflection of the change that causes within a city. And so thank you so very much to all of the mayors from Tampa, Baltimore, Kansas City, and Philadelphia for giving us access to your people, so that we can have these amazing conversations and lift each other up collectively. So it has been an honor
100%.
and a blessing for me to be a part of that.
Yeah, 100%. And we're excited for you guys to join us next season. We are building a network here. If you are doing cool things in your city, in vibrancy, in building public space, reach out to us. We want to have conversations with you. We want to learn more. We want to help us learn from each other. We want this podcast to be one where you guys are excited to celebrate the successes and the wins that you've had and the data that you've collected and the human behavior that you've observed. So do reach out to us, Emily at storycity.app and Tim at storycity.app. We will be back in our second season, probably in around about 6 weeks. We like to record our seasons up front so that we can build those through lines, so that we can build those connections between seasons and places and the case studies that we tell. So you'll see us in around about 6 weeks' time. But until then, we hope you have a really great adventure.
Stay positive, everyone. Cheers and have a great life.
The Vibrant Spaces podcast is produced by Story City. You can find our entire archive on any podcasting app and on about.storycity.app, where we publish transcripts and show notes. This episode was produced by Tim Souza, and our staff includes Justin Kahn, Brett Ludwig, and Victoria Omitska. Our theme song is Happy Indie by Alex Guz. Our co-hosts are Tim Souza and me, Emily Craven. As always, thank you for listening. We hope you have a glorious adventure this week.